Religion has, for millennia, offered moral guidance to billions of people and shaped entire civilizations. And yet, when we look closely at the topic of human sexuality, that guidance often becomes a study in profound contradiction. So, in this explainer, we're going to investigate that complex and powerful relationship. To see what I mean, just consider two very different religious practices. On one hand, you have purity balls in the United States, where Christian daughters make a formal vow of virginity to God. But on the other hand, some traditions in Japanese Buddhism have, at times, viewed same-sex relations between monks as a kind of sacred path. This brings us to a fundamental question. How can the very same human act be framed as both the height of purity and a profound sin, all within religious frameworks? You see, this isn't just a simple contradiction. It's a core tension that really reveals a deeper truth about all this. The religious views on sexuality aren't just about personal piety. They are, and have always been, deeply political, shaping social structures and power dynamics in very real ways. Now, we often assume that religion's main role is to restrict sexuality, but that's not a historical universal at all. In some ancient belief systems, it was actually the denial of sexuality that was the transgression. The Greek myth of Hippolytus is a perfect example of this. His choice to live a chaste life wasn't seen as holy, but as an insult to the goddess Aphrodite, and for that, he was punished severely. But then, you have this view, which is in direct opposition to that. This quote, attributed to the Buddha, frames sexual desire not as a divine force to be honored, but as the very source of suffering itself. It's a fire, blocking the path to enlightenment, an act presented as more spiritually dangerous than the bite of a venomous snake. This ideology of sexual denial really took root and became institutionalized in early Christianity. Jesus' celibacy was seen as placing him above human sexuality. Then you have St. Paul, who framed marriage not as an ideal, but almost as a reluctant last resort for those too weak to remain celibate. And finally, St. Augustine codified this whole way of thinking, defining all sexual desire, even inside marriage, as a lingering stain of original sin. Okay, but if you're going to regulate something, you first have to be able to define it. And when we start to examine what different religions actually mean by the word sex, the very foundations of these moral systems start to look surprisingly unstable. It turns out the definition is incredibly fluid. It shifts dramatically depending on the culture, the religion, and the time period. What one system condemns as a grave sexual sin, another might not even classify as a sexual act at all. This spectrum of definitions is quite revealing. For the Taliban in Afghanistan, just the sight of a woman's ankle could be treated as a serious sexual crime. Meanwhile, for some Christian groups in the US, sex is defined very narrowly by penetration, which leaves out other acts. And then, in the teachings of Jesus, the act becomes entirely internal. A lustful thought is, in itself, adultery of the heart. And this flexibility in the definition, well, that's really the key. If the rules themselves aren't fixed, it suggests their purpose might be about more than just personal morality. In fact, you could argue these shifting sexual codes have served as a powerful tool for social control. We see this throughout history, religions creating these strong sexual boundaries to enforce social hierarchies. In the United States, for example, certain Christian doctrines were used to justify a racial boundary. In South Asia, Hindu scripture was used to uphold the caste system. And across much of the Islamic world, religious creed has defined the line. In each of these cases, policing who can have a relationship with whom becomes fundamental to policing the social order. In the United States, this control was explicitly racial, and the legal battle to tear it down wasn't just a brief struggle. It was a conflict that spanned centuries. It started with the first colonial laws way back in 1662, and it wasn't fully resolved until the year 2000, when Alabama finally became the very last state to remove its ban on interracial marriage. And the legal argument for this separation was openly theological. This quote is from the judge in the landmark Loving versus Virginia case, and it perfectly captures the rationale. Racial segregation wasn't argued as just a social policy. It was presented as a divine mandate, an order established by God himself that the state was simply obligated to enforce. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of these moral laws, though, is what happens when they come into conflict with institutional power. What we find is that supposedly absolute rules can be bent or even broken entirely when the reputation of the institution itself is on the line. For example, a 1962 Vatican document laid out the official protocol for handling allegations of child sexual abuse by clergy.
The procedure wasn't centered on justice for the victim. It was centered on the institution. Its 4 pillars were total secrecy, forcing silence on everyone involved, bypassing civil law, and its primary stated goal, protecting the reputation of the church.
In 2002, a fire broke out at a girls' school in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. This number, 15, represents the 15 students who died in that fire.
And the reason they died reveals a truly chilling moral calculation. According to multiple reports, Saudi Arabia's religious police actively blocked the girls' escape because they weren't wearing the proper head coverings. In that moment, a rule about religious dress was prioritized over the fundamental act of saving human lives. So, given this complex and frankly often troubling history of control and contradiction, how can a modern, diverse society even begin to think about sexual ethics? What principles could possibly serve as a foundation? Well, one alternative is to shift the focus away from these ancient, contested doctrines and toward principles that are rooted in our shared human dignity. A framework like that might be built on 3 pillars. First, the free will of every individual to decide their own moral code. Second, consent as the absolute, non-negotiable foundation for any and all sexual interaction. And third, a duty of respect for the private, consensual choices that other people make. And this framework leaves us with a final, challenging question. For anyone who would insist on imposing their own religious sexual morality on everyone else, it asks them to simply consider the reverse. How would you feel being forced to live under someone else's sacred laws? And this really suggests a different way of thinking about religious freedom. Maybe it's not the right to impose your rules on others, but the right to be free from having their rules imposed on you.